1945, President Truman authorized Operation Paperclip. The Joint Intelligence Committee, which was the intelligence branch of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, set up its own subcommittee, the JIOA, created for the sole purpose of directing Operation Paperclip, with the exploitation branch under Army Intelligence and the War Department General Staff in charge of the physical execution of the project. Through this tangled web of sister agencies and subcommittees, the government was able to effectively hide, twist, and erase many parts of these Nazi scientists' pasts. The hunt for Nazi scientists now had official sanction. But America didn't only bring engineers from Germany. Many doctors were sent to the US as well. Hermann Becker-Freising was a doctor who joined the Nazi Party in 1933. He worked for the Luftwaffe on projects dedicated to helping pilots survive in cases of aircraft malfunction and open-sea crashes. He worked in the Medical, Experimental and Instruction Division of the Aviation Medicine Research Institute. On May 19, 1944, Hermann Becker-Freising attended a conference concerning the potability of seawater. He and another scientist, Schäfer, represented the Chief of Medical Service of the Luftwaffe. In his closing statement at the conference, Becker-Freising expressed his concerns that the experiments were not conducted at realistic enough conditions of sea distress and needed to be tested to a greater extent. Because such experiments would likely result in death, using volunteers was out of the question. Instead, Dachau concentration camp inmates were used. Becker-Freising later assisted in carrying out the experiments. Because of this, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for crimes against humanity at Nuremberg, though he later appealed and his sentence was commuted to 10 years. After serving his time, Becker-Freising was transported under Operation Paperclip to the US and worked for the Army in Texas. In 1947, at the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, Kurt Blume, the chief of research on bacteriological warfare in Germany during World War II, was accused of being responsible for experiments on involuntary human subjects and, quote, the murder and mistreatment of tens of thousands of Polish nationals. The human experiments with plague vaccines and various bacteria Blume carried out at the Dachau concentration camp were well known of and documented, but under US pressure, Blume was acquitted. 2 months later, he was moved to the United States after the JIOA hid any records that mentioned the Nuremberg trials or his war crimes. In 1951, Blume signed papers agreeing to work for the US Army Chemical Corps. Each one of the scientists had something to contribute to their respective fields. But how does one weigh the benefits? These people were once Nazis, which must somehow have carried over to their work later on in life. Some of them were even convicted as war criminals. The US government then employed them and simply hid their Nazi past from the public. The government certainly still has this power to manipulate history. In 1998, the Senate passed the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. The act declared that Nazi war criminal records should not be protected any longer by the government. However, most of the Disclosure Act is simply a list of possible reasons for exemption, and so many records remain undisclosed to the public. In the case of Operation Paperclip, key government agencies made decisions concerning the greater public good. They decided which war criminals were worth bringing into the country without any real checks on what they were doing. This moral hazard still exists now, and even to a greater extent, for we live in a time of secret prisons and the suspension of habeas corpus.
The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
The CIA think that they have a mandate to journey to the furthest corners of their imagination to try stuff out. We have the right to surround a bunch of people and treat them as if they were guinea pigs in the middle of an experimental lab.
But many drugs were tested in this way. A decision was made at the highest levels of the CIA to do testing on unwitting Americans. As one CIA document says, such testing would be operationally realistic. A former CIA official who worked on these programs describes for the first time how the decision was made. He did not wish to be filmed or recorded. Thus his remarks are read by someone else.
I think every last one of us felt sorry to attempt this kind of thing. We knew we were crossing the line. Every decent kid knows he shouldn't steal, but he does it sometimes. We knew damn well we didn't want anyone else to know what we were doing.
The decision was made to do testing on unwitting victims. It was decided they should be on the fringes of society because they were most vulnerable.
It was the borderline underworld, prostitutes, drug addicts, and other small-timers who would be powerless to seek any kind of revenge.
Conscious mind is being pushed out of the way where there's no capacity for question, reason, conscious awareness, and conscious thought. Because when you're operating in these different compartments, for example, the one that developed because of my father's sexual abuse. When my father would come in and to sexually abuse me, the same part of my brain that was familiar with that would open up so that he would do it again and again as needed, and yet it would still remain compartmentalized in this section. Our brains are phenomenal. So that the rest of my mind could function normally. Then my father began prostituting me. My mother's father had a Blue Masonic Lodge. He ran a Blue Masonic Lodge in up in Michigan, and it was where the politicians were just real. As local politicians were just real active, and my father began prostituting me out to different ones who were aware of the child abuse because of the knowledge coming through on CIA mind control and being so much a part of a criminal faction of our government that's also referred to as the shadow government.
My purpose at the Grove was sexual in nature, and therefore my perceptions were limited to a sex slave's viewpoint. As an effective means of control to ensure undetected proliferation of their perverse indulgences, slaves such as myself were subjected to ritualistic trauma. I knew each breath I took could be my last, as the threat of death lurked in every shadow. Slaves of advancing age, or with failing programming, were sacrificially murdered at random in the wooded grounds of Bohemian Grove, and I felt it was simply a matter of time until it would be me. Rituals were held at a giant, concrete owl monument on the banks of, ironically enough, the Russian River. These occult-ish sex rituals stemmed from the scientific belief that mind-controlled slaves required severe trauma to ensure compartmentalization of the memory, and not from any spiritual motivation. My own threat of death was instilled when I witnessed the sacrificial death of a young dark-haired victim, at which time I was instructed to perform sexually as though my life depended upon it. I was told the next sacrifice victim could be you. Any time when you least expect it, the owl will consume you. Prepare yourself and stay prepared. Being prepared equated to being totally suggestible, i.e., on my toes awaiting their command. It seems obvious to me now that Bush was referring to those actively engaged in implementing the New World Order through chaos and mass mind control, aka media conditioning.
What you have to understand, Jean, is that sometimes there are forces and events too big, too powerful, with so much at stake for other people or institutions, that you cannot do anything about them, no matter how evil or wrong they are and no matter how dedicated or sincere you are or how much evidence you have. That is simply one of the hard facts of life you have to face. You have done your part. You have tried to expose the evil and wrongdoing. It has hurt you terribly. But it has not killed you up to this point.
Although they are clearly bewildered and perplexed by what is going on inside their heads, they accept this without any particular outward show of distress.
They lost their moral compass and turned into these experimenters. It turned in on itself and became dark.
That was slowly gaining control and finally gained control with the Kennedy assassination. It traumatized the nation to see it on TV over and over and over again. That trauma left people suggestible, left that subconscious open to where they were highly suggestible and easily led. And that was the beginning. Consider what I'm saying with the effects of what happened 9/11 or 9/11. On 9/11, the whole nation was traumatized. And in that trauma, people became suggestible. And it gave the shadow government a firm control over all of us that is just finally now shaking. It's finally starting to stop because people are waking up. And they're waking up en masse. And it's happening all over this country.
The brutal reality of expanding foreign occupation and the harsher and harsher forms of control are the real tinder of Islamic fundamentalism, insurgencies, and terrorism. We can try and blame the violence on the clash of civilizations. We can naively tell ourselves that we are envied for our freedoms. We can point to the Quran. But these are fantasies that divert us from facing the central dispute between us and the Muslim world, from facing responsibility.
At a decade earlier, the CIA turned to George White for help. White was now a high-ranking narcotics official, and by this time the stories about George White were legendary.
So the waiter says, "You may help you, monsieur?" And George White was busy talking with me. I paid no attention to the waiter, so the waiter tapped him on the shoulder, says, "May I help you, monsieur?" George White turned around, whipped his gun out, and stuck it in the guy's face like this in this crowded restaurant.
He placed his hands on my jaw while he said, "Soon we'll have you purring like a wet-oiled machine. All of your moving parts are pivotal and gliding with ease. Melt into my hands. I'll hold your jaw to keep it from slipping while you slip through a window in lime." He then jerked my jaw out of joint and roughly gratified himself in my throat. My jaw is permanently damaged from Cheney. I have chronic TMJ.
The CIA was set up to protect the West from communism, but in doing so, it had employed Nazis in Europe, experimented with drugs in America, and overthrown democratically elected leaders in the Middle East. The next stop on this secret world tour of mayhem was Africa.